Good morning, everyone. Fantastic. So if we have understood Zoom correctly now, you should only be able to chat with us, the panelists. So good morning indeed to everyone. And let's pretty much get started here. What do you say, Fabian?
Yeah, let's jump right into it. I mean, we have a very tight 1 hour session in front of us.
Yeah, exactly. So I hope that everyone can see my screen and that you have brewed yourself a nice cup of coffee or tea. Because indeed, we are super excited to have so many attendees here today. It makes me very enthusiastic. In matter of fact, there's almost 300 of you. So that is very nice indeed. Now, before we get started here, today is the first series of a number of master classes. And we're kicking it off with the webinar called Boosting ITOM Beyond the CMDB. And what we're going to show here today, it is not only, let's say, theoretical concepts, but it is actually being based upon approximately 40 or so implementations. So it is real lessons learned, and this is not a, let's say, repetition of product documentation. Before I continue, Fabian, my screen, do you see the top here?
It's perfectly visible. Like I just see the presentation and the first slide.
Okay, fantastic, good. All right, so I'm quite excited about the year 2021, not only because I think we might have an actual chance to return to normality, but also because of AIOps and ITOM. And we do have an agenda here today. So when we're speaking about creating a roadmap, because that is the lesson that we're hoping that you can take away with you home today. It's not that there is one roadmap to rule them all, so to speak, but in matter of fact, there are many ways to construct a roadmap. So we want to give you really the best information in how you can construct your own ITOM roadmap, essentially. And that constitutes for a number of things that you will learn here today. So for example, we will be speaking about the CMDB plateau. I will be speaking quite a lot about business versus IT innovation, resourcing and efforts. You as well, Fabian, will jump in a lot around, all various topics here, especially on the technical sides. And then, of course, we will, just by the nature of this webinar, touch upon some of the ServiceNow ITOM modules.
Exactly.
And hopefully next steps, and also take some self-promotion here for upcoming webinars as well.
Yeah.
So I don't think I've forgotten anything here in terms of the agenda. It is in no particular order. You will just pick up things as you go, really. But before we get started, I think it's appropriately that we introduce ourselves first. So my name, who is speaking right now, is Alexander Ljungström. I am the managing director of Einar Partners. And in the past, I have worked directly at ServiceNow in their ITOM team. And yeah, I am very passionate about ITOM and especially how it, let's say, impacts an organization. So that's shortly about me, but who are you, Fabian?
Thank you. My name is Fabian Kunzke. I'm from Germany, the IIOps and ITOM lead at the ITSM Group. And I've done several projects with different customers, ranging from small multi-service providers to big industry leaders. And I'm really excited about the topic, especially when it comes to transforming essentially what I like to call a fire department IT operations to a, well, proactive IT operations. And I'm super excited to essentially bring that industry forward in that way.
Yeah, super nice. And maybe we should mention something just regarding the Zoom webinar here before we jump in. So you have the possibility right now to do two things. One is you can write Q&A, which is essentially a question directed to us, or you can write in the chat, which would be directed to us as well. Unfortunately, I don't think we will have time to answer the questions now live during the webinar, but because this is a first of many master classes, when you ask questions, it means that we can answer them to you personally. So pretty much me and Fabian here will spend some time after the webinar to direct you individually with your questions. And also if you have any feedback, we would love to hear that. So I just want to mention that straight away here. All right, sounds pretty good, I think. Then let's
Let's
get
jump
on.
into it.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll kick off with just kind of setting the stage here a little bit and speaking about the CMDB plateau and why organizations tend to struggle to look further. So first of all, I know there are many of you here today, almost 300, and you might be in various roles. We saw in the participants list that there are quite a lot of consultants of various sorts, solution architects, technical consultants, business process consultants, doesn't really matter. Then, of course, we have your dear product owners who perhaps are facilitating today an ITSM platform such as ServiceNow, or you're working in one capacity or another with IT operations. Or perhaps you simply are a decision maker, anything from the CXO level to VP or a manager of some sort. But regardless of which camp you find yourself in, the reason you have, let's say, patched in here today is, of course, because you are curious about an ITOM roadmap. And we will try to address all three different audiences here in our master classes. At the same time, we hope for your understanding that we have to keep it somewhat high level. But yeah, these are the typical roles that find themselves in a CMDB plateau. And if we start looking at where organizations find themselves then, so this is very, very common. And I'd say approximately 50 to 60% of all customers that I am talking to find themselves somewhere here. So it often starts off with just kind of initiating ServiceNow. And this is typically the stage where legacy tools go away in favor for ServiceNow then. And then maybe you pull in a bunch of consultants that starts doing the basic platform installation. And almost always the first step in ServiceNow is to configure ITSM processes. So the basic change management, incident management, and so forth. Then, and hence the reason of the webinar today, it is quite popular to get started with discovery in order to build your CMDB. So essentially, a lot of effort is spent on mapping out your private and public clouds or your on-prem data centers or whatever it is. But in the end of the day, you end up with a basic CMDB. Of course, you might have other sources than discovery here too. But this is a very, very common scenario. And yes, there is a lot of value here already. But this is what I like to call the, let's say, plateau, because a lot of people are speaking about where to go from here. Hence the topic here today. And I think this is a really, really valid thing to ask yourselves, because in my experience, when we're really speaking about moving beyond just that CMDB, there are so much information out there. And if you ask 10 different people, you will get 10 different answers. So today you will probably get the 11th answer and our view and opinion on it. But I want to start off here with speaking shortly about business versus IT innovation and what sets them apart. And the assumption right now is that you at least at some point have heard a little bit around ServiceNow and that you know what the ITSM modules are, and indeed that you know what the Discovery and CMDB does. This is not something we will go through today. Now, here comes a little bit of a controversial opinion maybe, but I always like to simplify things. And when we speak from a purely, let's say, roadmap perspective, I often find that it's very common that people purely think of a roadmap as which modules are we going to configure or install, or perhaps which licensing model are we going to follow, and that determines the roadmap. Well, in my opinion, that is a little bit upside down thinking, because if we're looking at the modules or the licensing, that should not be the roadmap itself, but that is the outcome from a roadmap rather. And really, if we simplify this, the next steps here, regardless of which path you're taking here, in my opinion, then it can be split up into two different main categories, let's say. The first one here, which you see, is CSDM and mapping IT services. This is also known as application and service portfolio. And I like to call this area business innovation, just to make it simple. Then down here, we have the more technical parts. So things like event management, machine learning, AI, and so forth, where we really start consolidating alerts. And yet again, for the sake of ease, I'm just going to call this IT innovation. So when you stand at this crossroads here as an organization looking forward, whatever your decisions are, in 99% of the cases, they can be categorized in either business or IT innovation. And that for me is a very simple thing to look at. And the reason here is that when we have the IT layer and, let's say, the application and service and business layer, we can actually start correlating these two worlds closer to each other. And of course, this has been a discussion for so many years. How do we bring business closer to the IT? But this is the core and essence of it. So business and IT innovation. Then we might apply a layer of automation. And by the way, it doesn't have to happen in this order. This is just to give you a blueprint. And through that automation, on an IT perspective, we can fix, troubleshoot, and heal things, especially in event management. And towards the end users, it's very common that we start introducing things like password resets, user requests, software installations, and so forth. So that's pretty much like your service portal where people maybe request a new software and it gets automatically installed. Now, here we have another part, which is these days called the cloud provisioning and governance. For you, let's say, old schoolers out there, you might know this as cloud management. But also here, there is a correlation. So when you start doing cloud management, then cloud services would tightly be correlated to your application and service portfolio. At a similar way towards the end users, then you can publish a cloud user portal. And that kind of goes more than to the catalog and service portal side of things. But I just wanted to set the stage here with this high-level functional blueprint, and this gives a fairly good oversight over the different modules. Now, what I'm going to speak about starting with here is business innovation then. So speaking of business innovation, starting from the left top corner here is CSDM. And there's a lot of talk about CSDM today, and it stands for the Common Service Data Model. And it's a very, very hot potato, especially in the ServiceNow world. And it's almost like a urban legend or a myth, like the Loch Ness Monster. Everyone have heard about it, but few people have seen it. And in essence, the CSDM, in my opinion, should be considered a data model which can be equipped for really, let's say, scaling things. So regardless of if it is in the IT department or for business users or enterprise architects, everyone adheres to the same data model in the end of the day.
And I think I would like to add one point there, because it's really important to understand with the CSDM that although it's a blueprint, it is not the same across companies, right? Because that's oftentimes a thought process that can hinder a business to benefit from it a lot by constantly asking, how are others doing it? How is an MSP doing it? Even though I'm an industry production environment or something like that. So it's really key to understand that if we talk about blueprints, especially in ITOM, they are there to be applied and they are based off of best practices, but they are not the law in the West, right? Yeah. They are to be individualized, and it can change over time. And in my opinion, if you look at the service landscape, that landscape will change for a company over time. So in return, the CSDM itself as a model will be changing over time. So it might be that we talk about a CSDM right now that looks completely different in 5 years. Just a point to add, to not get too caught into applying that blueprint with brute force, because it can actually hinder your business development a bit.
Yeah, and I love that you say that. And let me expand upon that just in a little bit, because what you said there is very important, especially around the best practices. Because when we speak about CSDM, and if we go here to the right corner, then it is very tightly connected to the application and service portfolio, which in essence is what do we offer and how do we offer it. And this is where you have all the service owners, the application owners, the enterprise architects, the IT department, whatever it might be, they can all be related to the application and service portfolio. But this is a very important part here, which is in the right corner, we see mindset. And when we speak about business innovation, it's not always a tangible ROI, so a return on investment, because when we speak about innovation, a lot of, let's say, the win you are doing is not always things you can measure in hard numbers, but it is really a cultural mindset. When you move towards this direction, you also impact the culture. You impact the culture towards the end users, you impact your internal business culture as well. How does employees perceive the IT department, how smooth the company is running? And it really is almost philosophical in a certain extent. So the mindset is very related to how we define our business operations, essentially. And for a lot of companies, this can be a big threshold to get over, actually, especially if you are very used to having a certain rigid structure since before. Now, last but not least are the IT services. In the end of the day, at least the year 2021, everything in one capacity or another can be derived to IT services. If we innovate and do good in IT services, the business will also do good and innovate, because they are so tightly connected today. So I really see the IT services here as the beating heart of business innovation. But let's speak a little bit around CSDM. So a lot of people think that CSDM, just like you mentioned, Fabian, it's some sort of model that some really clever guy at ServiceNow came up with, for example. And although there are really intelligent people at ServiceNow, it is not one inventor of CSDM. What actually happened with the CSDM was that way back when ServiceNow weren't as developed as now, at ServiceNow, they started noticing patterns in how customers customized and configured their CMDB. And based on these patterns, they were able to see that 80% of our customers create a completely new CI for services. We probably want to ship that out of the box, and so forth and so on. So CSDM, it is not a standard necessarily defined by ServiceNow, but it is the accumulative standard from the entire industry being made formalized, if that makes sense. And that is for me very important to understand, that when you start applying the CSDM, it's easy to think that, oh, now we are following the advice of ServiceNow. Well, that is truth with modification. In matter of fact, you are following the common standard of the industry and how they define their business, their application portfolio, their IT services, and a lot of other things, essentially. I should mention here that a large part of the CSDM is actually service mapping. And these two topics in particular, so CSDM and service mapping, we're going to have a scheduled webinar about coming up a little bit later. So keep an eye out for this. But with that being said, I don't know if I forgot anything in this very high level crash course about CSDM. And I'd actually like to hand it over to you here, Fabian, to drill down a little bit more around service mapping and those parts.
Yeah, thank you. So,
I'm
can you
seeing your
see?
desktop.
Oh, it's the wrong. Okay,
Yeah.
1 second. Thank you for letting me know. Let's switch to this one. Perfect.
That's better.
Are you seeing my presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. There was actually an interesting question that I would like to shortly address. It was the question that in cloud environments, if there is a cloud model or a CMDB model that can be found or is documented somewhere. And it's a really interesting question that we won't have the time to dive too deep into it. But when we are looking at, for example, ServiceNow, as you said before, Alex, with each release, they are also expanding their database or the CMDB model, adjusting to what is best practice or becoming best practice on the market. I think it's an interesting topic that I would like to take with me and answer in a more thorough way, because this is a very bland answer, just saying that there's a tool for it that can give you that. But thank you for asking the question. I will take that, or we will take that with us. So going into service mapping, and this is something really interesting. I always like to talk a bit, and I will do that now as well, about the wisdom pyramid, which essentially is data, information, knowledge, and then wisdom. Wisdom essentially being, well, applying knowledge. And it's really interesting because the goal of an IT operations management should always be to make decisions based on knowledge and not based on a gut feeling. And the starting off point with that oftentimes is a discovery, because the discovery gives you that data layer, right? What the discovery essentially does is, and I like to take that anecdote from a ServiceNow guy that I once met, who said, the discovery essentially is you walking into a dark room with a shotgun shooting, and everything that shouts is now a device that we are excited about. And that is essentially correct. So the discovery scans essentially your network devices. And that leads to your technical teams, to your third level, having a database where they can essentially know, okay, if something is going wrong, what device is it essentially related to? But the problem is that that has a huge disconnect between the business level and the technical level. Because although you have that data, your business still doesn't really have an information or a connection to it. And service mapping is one way to actually solve that, right? I had one customer who said that his dream state, he was a multi-service provider, his dream state of a CMDB would be if he could show his customers what services they are using and the availability of the services, the planned outages, the planned maintenance. And that is something that service mapping allows us to do. So in a classic way, what service mapping does is it relates the CIs, so the data that you already have, and builds a service tree, essentially top down, bottom up, so that you know, okay, this Linux server has something to do with my service providers in some service. And it does that not like the discovery does it, but in a bit of a more precise way. So it enters with an application point, for example, and then via the configuration information goes down from there. But the interesting part is you could also do that manually. However, in the current IT landscape, we are looking at very dynamic environments. For a matter of fact, we're looking at environments that are so dynamic that even the service mapping in a classical sense, based on the discovery, isn't quick enough in virtualized environments, for example. And ServiceNow introduces what they call a tag-based discovery there, which essentially means that if you have these cloud-based environments where you're already tagging certain resources in regards to the customer, we can now do that backwards in the CMDB, use that same tag and build the service tree. What that leads us to is a connection between the business layer and our technical layer. Because that dream that the multi-service provider told me about is actually possible now, right? We have the ability to show the business, okay, listen, if you have a service up here and you want to increase its availability, we have to do something down here, and vice versa, right? And the thing where that comes into play the most, essentially moving from a data to an information level, is with the event management. I like to take the event management as a next step from there, because when utilized correctly, it shows the service mapping, the service map trees in a bit of a, what I call Christmas fashion, right? So if something happens, it lines up. With event management, we get to the point of something that again, the reason why I'm doing this, I want to move away from a fire department IT operations. So if something is on fire, we try to extinguish it and be proactive, right? We had the same move in quality management 20 years ago, and now it's time to finally apply that to IT operations. And event management is one of the ways to get there, because now we have information. And the question is, how do we get one level further? How do we get beyond information? How do we get to actually have knowledge? And to have knowledge, we can apply our past experience and knowledge bases, for example. We connect that with the information that we have now. And in event management, we have alerts and events that are currently happening in our infrastructure that get connected to the CMDB. We have an overall overview. We can see what kind of services and how their availability is impacted by these alerts. And based on the data of these alerts and these events, we can, well, help our service desk, for example, help the agents to make decisions of what is of a high priority and what is of a lower priority. Now, all of these steps are great because they help us to reach a state where some customer might go into the service portal fuming because something isn't working again, trying to open an incident. And before they open the incident, a message pops up with like, hey, listen, we are aware that your service is currently having an issue. We're sorry for that. In the next 3 hours, we will fix it, right? This is a state that if we combine the information that we get through the service mapping, which is connecting the technical level with the business level, and the alerts and events from an event management to be faster than our customer. And this massively aids us in keeping customers happy. But it is still reactive. We are still reacting to things happening. And this is where AI ops and especially machine learning comes into play. So AI ops is AI supported operations. And what we can do here is we as humans, we react based on past experience and knowledge automatically. And we can train machines to do the same, basically in two ways. One of the ways is if something is out of the ordinary. Let me give you an example. If you have your dishes and you put them into the dishwasher and it goes through a cycle, you open it up and you're like, I thought I put in 5 of these plates, right? Now something for you is out of the ordinary and it's not good. We can train machines to do the same. So essentially we can train a machine through machine learning, we can train an algorithm to say, okay, this is normal, yeah, and then something just suddenly spikes for no reason. Still nothing too big, but if that spike happens out of the ordinary, it could indicate a problem before it actually occurs, letting us to reach the point where we can act before something is happening. And the other way that we can address or utilize machine learning is maybe more powerful even. It is learning from historic events. Essentially, when you're driving a car on a snowy surface and you notice you go too fast, you can't brake anymore, you know this is going to lead to a crash, right? You as a human, you know that because you might have experienced it or you have learned about it. And with machine learning, it's the same thing. We can make an algorithm essentially aware of that certain events, certain historic events have led to an alert. So if these happen again, we can now say, oh, well, maybe there's something happening as well, allowing us to, in the actual operations part, to be proactive. And then there's one last step, right? Because now we are able to make operational decisions based on knowledge, because we have a knowledge base, we have historic events, maybe a simple reporting telling us what to do. But this is in operations, this is still on a technical layer. How can we get that same knowledge and that same decision-making on a business level? And this is a step where we go from reactive to predictive, basically with analytics, which is more intensive reporting, sorry. Also something that we will have a webinar about later down the road. So we now have, with the service mapping, the connection between what happens on a technical layer and what happens on a business layer. And through knowledge, essentially knowledge bases, through maybe asset and integrated asset management, we can have a lot of information, and knowledge being essentially the part where we say, oh, okay, based on that information and based on our experience, this is what we know to do. And based on that, we are now wanting to do decisions. I'm going to give you some examples of what that may mean. One of the questions that you could ask your techies, let's call them that way, is if we would swap our top 3 incident generating models in our infrastructure for newer or better ones, how long would it take? Who do we have to get involved? What are the services that may be impacted? And would we make our money back in the next 5 years? Really interesting question. And the interesting thing for me is the data for that is already there, most likely. You know how expensive the new models are. You know how expensive the old ones are. You have a backlog of incidents. You know how often they went down. But most of the time, with a lot of customers, these data pieces aren't connected. They aren't linked together. The business layer isn't connected to the technical layer. Another question, for example, what is now very let's call it trendy, but also it makes a lot of sense, is moving towards public cloud environments rather to self-hosted environments. But sometimes I see project initiatives where they're doing it because it's good to do, apparently, and someone told them that's good. But the question is, do we gain anything from it? Are our services more available? Do we have a cost-saving factor in that? Or are we just doing it because it's cool, in quotes, right? And I highly encourage you to just grab a cup of coffee, sit together with your colleagues and ask these questions. Maybe even broader questions. Ask your colleagues, what would happen if we would move from Windows to Linux in our whole environment? Not because it indicates you how good or bad your ITOM is, but it indicates and gives you a feeling of where you can go next. Because if you have that business information to your hand, if you have these connections made already, then maybe you have to take a different step from someone who might not have that connection yet, right? And that's something really interesting. And the way to get there, to get from a data level to a wisdom level, is with service mapping and utilizing the information, connecting it to knowledge bases, connecting it to experiences, maybe leveraging AI ops and machine learning to be proactive and no longer be a fire department IT operations management. I hope I didn't forget something, Alex. Is there something that you...
And I think you're spot on there. And I'm going to hijack your screen sharing here to just continue on that thought.
Go ahead.
Because you're absolutely spot on that when we speak about machine learning, it's a lot of fuss around that these days. And there's a lot of hype. We hear AI, we hear machine learning, we hear all of these things all the time. And a lot of people question, is there really any value in it? And yes, there is value, because in the past 2 years, all of these machine learning, all of these algorithms, everything, they have become way, way more commercialized. So you don't need a team of 10 data scientists to get started with AI ops and machine learning, but it is actually a much shorter road there. And that is what I want to speak more about right now. So all of these things we've spoken about, so far I covered the business innovation a lot and high level about that. And you, Fabian, you have spoken here a lot more on, let's say, the technical IT innovation and machine learning. But what are the actual resourcing and effort? So how do we build the basis for a roadmap in either of these directions?
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Yeah, so let's speak some numbers and data. And this is just pure, this is based on pure experience. I've been working almost soon a decade actually with ServiceNow. And
Yeah.
here, I've interacted with so many customers. So these are the 4 factors to consider when you want to make the decision of which direction should we go towards. We have cost variables, we have implementation time, we have organizational engagement, and then a very important part here, which is the consultancy dependency. Because you don't want to end up in a situation where you just throw money on expensive consultancies and then get very little for it. We want to avoid that. We want to work smart with how we engage consultancies, such as Einar Partners or ITSM Group. And this will be divided in a few different areas here. So if we do a quick analysis of the business innovation, then I'm actually going to start here in the bottom about speaking of the effort. So when it comes to business innovation, and as you remember, when I'm saying business innovation, I mean primarily service portfolio, services, and application layers. Then in the effort perspective, there is a lot of internal time spent here. So in my opinion, if you want to succeed with this CSDM and business innovation, the determining factor there is coordination. And I'm going to repeat that: coordination and coordination and coordination. Very rarely is it a technical issue, but it's almost always to coordination. Because when you start with business innovation, you are essentially engaging the entire organization through all layers, from the end users to the support organization, to the business owners, to the enterprise architects, and so forth and so on. It might sound very overwhelming. It's not if you take it bit by bit in a structured, let's say, fashion, but it is a lot of internal time spent on getting this up to speed. And also a lot of effort in politics, because everyone has an opinion on how you should define your services. Everyone has an opinion on a standard which should be followed, or whatever it is. And that is seriously a factor to consider, that all of these different stretching opinions, what you might end up with if you're not careful, is essentially just a war room of how things should be. And no one really wants to get there. From a win perspective, then, we do have culture. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the win is purely cultural. So you get into a service-minded mindset. And this really happens throughout all the layers of an organization. And to give some practical examples, what I mean here with culture, because it might sound very abstract. What I'm referring to when I'm speaking about culture is something like, okay, in the past, whenever we've had an issue, we are used to use a set of categories. So when I'm reporting an incident, I am reporting it on a certain category. And in worst case, you leave that responsibility to the end user to know which category or which type of incident should they raise themselves. Meanwhile, if you do business innovation and CSDM in ServiceNow, you rely more on a service mindset. So that is just one example. Another example is, for example, around metadata or metadata in the CMDB. So historically seen, you might have CI owners, or you might have support group on CIs, or cost centers on CIs, or whatever it is. And that can be made redundant with using CSDM and application and portfolio mapping. Because rather than having a lot of metadata to maintain on all of these different CIs, then you maintain the primarily metadata in a service-oriented way rather. And that's something which is tangible, something that makes things more efficient, especially when you do like internal billing and so forth. ROI, of course. As I said, there might be difficult to find direct business cases with tangible ROI, because how do we know tangible ROI from moving to categorization to a service-oriented mindset? It might be difficult to measure those KPIs, but something which is not difficult to measure is the general speed and agility. That can be done. So let's speak then about the organizational engagement when we look at business innovation. We do have, of course, the technical staff, which are heavily involved, especially when it comes to mapping the IT services and how they relate to the business. Then we have service owners. Yet again, important here to have various formalized roles of service owners. So application owners or enterprise architects, whatever it might be. It's also very common here to engage the support organization, because as you start applying the CSDM and business innovation, they as well will start speaking a new language. And in the end of the day, the reason why we're all doing this often is for the end users. We want to make it simple for them, right? We don't want to live in a complicated world, but we want to automate things. So the end users must be kept in the perspective when we're speaking about service-oriented mindset. So these 4 pillars, they constitute a service-aware organization then. Some hard numbers and data around implementation time and efforts. So this is of course not always true, and it's not written in stone, but it should give you a fairly accurate indication of what is the actual effort you can expect to be spending. So during the build phase of business innovation, especially around service mapping, and when I say build phase is when you're actually starting to implement it, then that typically requires 1 full-time employee. Then it's up to you whether you want to outsource that to a consultant or if you educate and enable someone internally. And then what I call during maintenance, when it just happens to, you need to maintain all of this in the future, that is typically half an FTE, especially in service mapping. And you see here some timestamps. We have 3 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, and that should say plus 12 months. And if we're looking then here at the very shortest path here, and I have seen organizations doing this entire business innovation track in roughly half a year. The determining factors there are leadership commitment, so the leadership teams are on board. You have some good business cases to justify the costs. There often is already a certain degree of service awareness. It might be informalized, but at least you are already speaking in terms of services. And maybe here the most important part, which is the short feedback loops. And when I'm saying short feedback loops, I mean then between different stakeholders internally in your organization. Also, if you have formalized roles, that is very good. And then standardized application stack. So you don't have anything very obscure, but you run fairly standardized things, maybe some things in the cloud, maybe some things on-prem. If you find yourself in that camp already, then you can get up to speed with this business innovation and CSDM in roughly 6 months. However, most of the people are not there. The reality is the maturity is not always that high. So if we're looking somewhere in the middle here, we typically see a partial management commitment. So it's not the highest priority, but it does have some attention. There is a low level of service awareness. There might be people who know about the concept, but it is not being enforced today. There is also an average span of the feedback loops when we're speaking in timing. Maybe you have certain parts of your organization outsourced, and because you have them outsourced, maybe to IBM or DXC or whoever it might be, you obviously rely on a third party if you want like firewall openings or something like that. Informalized roles, so people might have roles, but they are informalized. So could be application owners, or it really anything within business innovation, service owners and so forth. And there is a mixture of application stacks. On the plus 12-month side, however, this is where it starts getting challenging. It's not impossible, but the effort is more on the organizational side of things. So here we often see that there is low or no management commitment. there is a fragmented organization, there is no formalization of roles, there is a high degree of consultancy dependency. And that is dangerous because a lot of people think, oh, the more we spend there on consultancy, the quicker we're going to get results. But consultants cannot change the fact that there is poor coordination, for example. And then last but not least, what I like to call obscure application stacks. And what does that mean? A practical example here. Let's say if you have a nuclear power plant and you would like to map the centrifuges from Siemens, yeah, that might be a little bit difficult compared to if you have a domain controller and Active Directory.
Yeah.
Could you jump in here 2 minutes from a technical side, Fabian? What do you say?
Yeah. Because we're running low on time a bit, I'm just
Exactly.
going to focus on 3 main points for the technical challenges. And funnily enough, for a service mapping environment, the technical challenges mainly are similar to discovery. The most important one being credentials, then comes credentials, and then after that, credentials, sometimes connectivity. And credentials is a big topic because if the credentials aren't available from a technical perspective, you're stuck, essentially. And the big important note that I want to give is if you are a consultancy company, if you are a provider of an implementation, essentially, train your customer to maintain the credentials. Do not actually maintain the credentials yourself, because that can lead to some security obscurity, which isn't always like it's not a good thing. What is different to the discovery environments is that the stakeholders play a key role in the service mapping success, because we need stakeholders to review service trees, right? We need stakeholders to tell us how some things are interacting with each other so that we don't have to guess based on what we find on the technical level. And then it's also important that we can get as much information about where to find certain configuration data. That can speed up, or if done badly, slow down a project massively. So the availability of stakeholders on the customer side is key for having a smooth running service mapping operation. And then the last thing is twofold. It's starting with the right focus on one side. So starting with a service mapping or mapping a tree that one has an actual business impact, maybe taking the most important one, but also using one that has the most reusability at other points, right? And then one last thing is keeping a storyline. It's so important to not fall into that, oh, we want to use discovery to discover everything part, because that can be quite bland. Rather, try to set yourself goals. For example, finding the last Windows XP user in your environment, or finding out if you have a load balancer that's overloaded on a service mapping perspective. If you have these goals, you know that you are actually working for something. And it's not just like, oh yeah, we're now doing service mapping. So keeping the excitement going, that's a really important one as well.
Yeah, I love that. Like tangible use cases, it's so important. When we speak then about IT innovation, and here from a win perspective, obviously, when you start speaking about event management and machine learning and these type of things, it's very, CMDB, etc. It's very realistic that you also can start phasing out some legacy tools. And in general, you see more tangible ROIs in IT innovation than in business innovation. You become more data-driven, especially then when you start applying machine learning and AI, and you can actually become an organization which pride yourself on using these latest technology, and that can be worth a lot. And then what I like to call toil reduction. And what I mean with toil reduction is essentially killing repetitive tasks. The more you automate, then the more time you spend on actually innovating things, kind of stuff. From an effort perspective, then I always say here, it's worth to invest in consulting when it comes to IT innovation, and it is worth to really kind of involve technical staff. And I will speak just a little bit quick here about some success factors of lowering the effort. So it's important when you start with IT innovation to have the buy-in from 2 layers, especially the monitoring teams. They should definitely be onboarded, and they should be fully committed to the cause, as well as the VP and management buy-in. So essentially that allows you to prioritize efforts. As I said, worth to invest a little bit more in consulting, because a lot of the things is on configuration. So if you can get the configuration up to speed quickly, you get that back in the long run. Then assign process owners and delegate clear process owners and early, and coach and educate them. And then of course the adaption side of things. And what I mean with that is, it's really important when you roll out IT innovation to actually involve the SMEs, so the subject matter experts, in that process. So they must be part of building the IT innovation, the future. They should not have it enforced on them, because then if they have it enforced on them, the adoption rate is likely lower. So if you want this to be a well-used product, then involve SMEs definitely. Quickly about the efforts around IT innovation. As I said, that typically goes faster. From a maintenance perspective, it usually requires half an FTE. And if we're looking at around 3 months timestamp, and this is fully realistic, then it is fairly, if you have easy integration possibilities to monitoring tools, you have centralized IT, you have an assigned process owner, and you really have the attention of the monitoring team and they are dedicated. I have seen event management and machine learning being applied in 3 months or less. A little bit more if you start having a lot of custom integrations. Maybe you have fragmented monitoring teams, or maybe you have a lot of firefighting already. That means toil. So if you have a lot of firefighting, it's difficult to spend time on innovating. And as I said, and this is not some shameless self-pitching here, but if you make the decision of, no, we're not going to involve experts and consultants, we're going to do this ourselves, I applaud you, and that can be a valid approach. But do keep in mind that as most is configuration based, it just makes sense to have that configured by people who have done it before. Something you like to add there quickly, Fabian?
Just quickly, credentials again, one thing, and as you have said already, highly standardized environments. If you're using very or very readily available monitoring tools, you're doing a lot easier with the innovation part on that.
Yeah, exactly. And worth mentioning here about both business innovation and IT innovation is, it's not always correlated to your organization and the size of your organization.
Yes.
Like how long time it takes to implement things. As a practical example, I have implemented and ran projects at customer organizations which have been tens of thousands of employees, and they have done it in a few months. Meanwhile, I have worked with very regional companies who maybe only have one centralized IT department, and it's taken 1.5 years. So it's all related to these coordination efforts. To wrap up here, the last 5 minutes, how could then practically some roadmaps look? Well, this is just an example, and of course you are free to adapt it as you like, but if we look here on the monthly timestamps, so this is based on a year, if you would have a more focus on the business and service side of things, it might make sense to at an early stage here involve then the organization to start mapping business layers and the portfolio. And then you can, at a fairly similar track, start mapping the IT services. Once that is done, then you can start with event management and automation, let's say. Meanwhile, if you have a technical focus, then event management and automation maybe comes first after discovery. Then perhaps you start mapping IT services, and still you are technically focused. You want to say, we really want to innovate the IT department before we go into the business. And that's why we select here to go with anomaly detection and machine learning as a next step. Once that is done and we really have that powerful IT house, only then do we start with business layers.
Yes. And one thing I like to add is what we are deliberately not focusing on right now is things like security operations with vulnerability response and, for example, software asset management. And the reason being is simply that those are highly use case dependent parts of ITOM, essentially. Either you need to do it or you don't, right? If you want to do it, and if you have to, they are similar to what an event management does. They build greatly upon that data layer that a discovery gives you. For a matter of fact, vulnerability response, even from a process side, looks somewhat similar to event management. And they are great steps to increase your technical focus, but also maybe your business focus, especially when it comes to licensing questions on the software asset management part. But the reason why they don't pop up here is simply because you either do it or you don't. There isn't really a natural ramp up, and it really ties into the storyline of event management. It focuses, or it goes in the same direction as with that topic. So again, if you have that requirement, keep in mind that it should be another box added to that event management part.
The same really goes for cloud management, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely.
And one final thing here I'd like to mention, a question I often get is, say, hey Alex, why can't we do both at the same time? Why can't we innovate IT at the same time we're doing all of these business things? Well, you can, of course you can, but it is being very ambitious. And as I mentioned before, remember what I said about coordination. So if it already requires a lot of coordination to do one of the things, you are pretty brave to entail on a journey where you're doing both at the same time.
Yes.
It's not impossible, but it is difficult, let's say.
It's difficult, yes.
Well, with that being said, as you can see here, based on this masterclass, it will take a lot of different tracks moving forward. And I would love if all of you attendees keep on checking the updates from both ITSM Group and Einar Partners.
Yes.
Because this is just an introduction to many, many masterclasses. I see, by the way, Fabian, that we have received quite a lot of questions in the Q&A.
Yes.
Yes. As I mentioned before, why don't you and me take half a day here after the webinar and just reach out to these individuals directly.
Exactly. Also, a question that was popping up in the chat quite often regarding the availability of this webinar after we finish today. It will be available online. So we will make that information readily available. We will also introduce some white papers in regards to the webinar.
That's right.
Ramp up, I would say. So this is really a kickoff, and I'm really excited, Alex, to do this journey with you. It's a kickoff to really lay a foundation and demystify that whole ITOM is a bit of expert and you only can do it if you really know everything. It's not like that. But what I want to do in this whole journey is truly get rid of that mysterious factor of ITOM and make it more clear and give you pipeline and an actual roadmap possibility with the knowledge behind it. That will be available in the future, so check on the updates.
I love that philosophy. And I saw here we got a final question, if we will share the slide deck. Yes, I have no problem. I feel comfortable doing that. So if you have signed up on the LinkedIn event, keep an eye open, because we will post there the video recording and then as well the slide deck. As well, you will get a notification. I think 2 days after this webinar, we will try to squeeze in some more kind of follow-ups there. But do stay tuned for more upcoming webinars and masterclasses, right, Fabian?
Yeah, and also if you have any topics that you would like to see more details about that we just touched and flew over today, feel free to contact us. You will find our contact information either over LinkedIn or over mail, so that we can also design this roadmap to actually aid you guys, because we're not doing this so that we have fun every Wednesday. Yeah, so this is for you guys.
Good. Then thank you, all of the attendees. Super nice that you could be here. And yeah, we wish you a fantastic day moving forward.
Have a nice day.
Yeah.